So, hi, Anna. Thank you so much for coming.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
Uh, yeah, we have been talking about your book for the last hour, which has been great.
Awesome.
Um, I I enjoyed it so much because I feel like it is just flipping so many things on its head, and it's refreshing because I, I think I've always avoided Westerns in so many ways for a variety of reasons, and I
Uh-huh.
want to ask you more about that. But where did the idea for this book come from?
Yeah, so first of all, my apologies if anybody hears yelping. My 4-year-old is currently going to bed. My husband's out of town, so his sitter is here with him, so he may be extra excited because he loves her. Um, but yeah, so I got the idea, I mean, in a weird way, actually. This was years ago. I was traveling in New Hampshire with a friend and her family, and we visited an old Shaker dwelling, which I don't know if anybody's been to like a Shaker dwelling. So they're really, it's beautiful and strange, and like they're known for like their architecture and their furniture, and like this one had like really beautiful like built-in like bureaus and little weird cabinets and all this stuff. But I was just sort of fascinated by, the history of the Shakers and like this group of people who lived, they didn't marry, they didn't have children, they lived together sort of communally, and they lived apart from the wider society. And it was also this time when I was like pretty recently married. We were thinking about whether we were going to have kids or not. And so sort of these ideas around like reproduction and cultural ideas around reproduction were really in my mind. And obviously we have a kid now. And I started writing like these sort of stories or like snippets that were about like people living in the woods, sort of separate from society, and they were kind of outcasts, and they had different relationships to sort of gender and family, but it like kind of wasn't coming together, and they weren't very good, and I would show it to my writing group and they'd be like, what is this? um and then after a while of kind of like noodling around on this stuff, I realized like, oh well, who else lives separate from society, like out in the wilderness? Well, outlaws. And I started thinking about making the book a Western. And the more I started reading, like not necessarily like mainstream Westerns, but sort of, and we can talk more about these, but like sort of alt Westerns, I realized there's always been sort of a way in which the Western is like, can be a genre about boundary crossing, and can be a genre about sort of like liminal spaces and doing things that you wouldn't be allowed to do in other places. And I found that really interesting. And that's sort of how, that's sort of the germ of it. And then once I realized it was a Western, then it became way easier to write.
That's really interesting because I feel like it's a tough genre, and I feel like Westerns are so steeped in this sort of American myth making, and they're, especially with like the spaghetti Westerns and all of that, there's this very like clear and, to my eyes, problematic sense of good and evil. Um, and your book is so much more nuanced than that, and your characters are complex, and they have good and bad. They're in their situation for a variety of reasons. Tell me a bit about making that ensemble, like for one, how you kind of put that all together and sort of subverted the genre and grappled with that sort of myth making, and then how you sort of created those characters that were from different backgrounds and experiencing different things, but were all sort of in ways cast out from society.
Yeah, I mean this so first of all, thank you. These are such great questions. Thank you so much for thinking so deeply about the book. I'm so glad that you enjoyed it. I mean, one thing that helped, I think, is that I hadn't actually read a lot of conventional Westerns. And like as soon as As soon as I started writing the book, I really banned myself from reading any like really like traditional mainstream westerns. Like I often do this if I'm working on a book, like I'll try not to read anything that's like really similar or in the same genre because I don't want to get biased. I don't want to like get other people's voices in my head, things like that. So like I even like my husband really wanted to rewatch Deadwood and I'd never seen it. And I was like, we can't watch it till I'm done. I'm sorry, it's gonna be years. And it was years. And then finally, like once it was copy edited, we watched it. So I sort of like, in some ways, when I was thinking about the tropes of the Western, I just had this very basic knowledge, like what you sort of like receive as an American about like, these are the shoot 'em ups and these are like, these are sort of the really basic tropes. And I knew that I wanted to subvert those. And then what I was reading were sort of like books that I consider to be Western adjacent, but it's not like your traditional, like Dirty Harry or whatever. So I read, there's a book called Lieutenant None, which is actually about someone who was born in the 1590s in Spain, and they were assigned female at birth and ended up at a pretty young age being sent to a convent to like basically like wait to find a husband. Like eventually like a husband would be like assigned to her, and then like they would get married. But then while they were in the convent, they were like, no, I'm not going to do this. And they cut all their hair off and made their nun's habit into a pair of pants and shipped off to the New World. And then like went and had all these adventures. And Lieutenant None is actually as a memoir. So it's like a real, like this person like wrote about their life. And I mean, I read it in translation. I think it's like written in Basque, and then translated into Spanish and then into English. So it's a real record of this person's life written by them. Um, and it's like both a story of, someone that probably today would identify as trans, although we can't know because it was hundreds of years ago. But certainly they were not like living by the gender strictures of their time. Um, they basically he like lived as a man in Peru and Chile and was treated as a man and like completely just passed. And then at a certain point, like went back and lived as a woman for a while and went back and lived as a man for a while and really like had all these different lives. But so definitely like, transgressing the gender boundaries of the time, and like reminding us that, those boundaries have always been pretty porous. Like it's not like a new thing to challenge them. But then it's also like kind of weirdly a Western, like it's about an outlaw, like like this person, like he gets in all these knife fights. Like I mean, it's like, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned sort of like moral complexity, because I did think about this, like with Westerns, like there's a lot of fighting and killing, and there is fighting and killing in my book. And like in this book, Lieutenant None, like this person like legit is always cutting people. So like on the one hand, it's like you're like, yeah, and then you're like, okay, wait, but also um but that book was this sort of like entry point for me into the idea that like, okay, like there have always been people for whom these like frontiers, these like colonial spaces, like are a place of experimentation and a place of freedom. Like you leave your Spanish convent, like you're here in Peru, suddenly you're allowed to be Antonio and here's your knife and you're doing whatever. And then of course also like in that case, you're a colonialist. So this person was like a Spaniard. Like he's actually pretty racist. Like he says a bunch of racist things in the book. So you kind of, as a contemporary reader, have to reckon with that. That was something that I thought of a ton while I was writing the book, and like even wish I'd reckoned with more. But like it's definitely like there in the Western genre, the idea that like like white people invented the concept of the West. Like nobody was like, this is the American West before Europeans got there. Um, so all that stuff was kind of like swirling as I was writing, and I was doing a lot of reading like Lieutenant None, or just also like reading a lot of history. I read a lot of like history of Black Americans in the West, a lot of history of Indigenous Americans in the West. And then I did read like just histories of outlaws, which are fun to read. And like I really started out without like that much knowledge of like, because these are all like totally real people. Like the Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were real, Billy the Kid was real. Like they were all real criminals and they all knew each other and they all lived in like a really small geographical area in a really circumscribed period of time. But I didn't know like basic stuff like how did they do their crimes? Or like who did they rob? Like how did they make their money? What would they do? So like that kind of stuff, like I sort of like immersed myself in just like reading up on.
So what was your research process like for all of that? Because that sounds like a really fun thing to kind of dig into.
It was really fun. I definitely did more research for this book than for any of my other books. So I traveled, like I went to Wyoming. The hole in the wall is real. It's like a real place. It's outside of Casey, Wyoming. You have to, it's hard to get to. Like you can drive to Casey and then you drive out into the mountains and there's a working ranch called like, I'm trying to remember. It's thanked in my acknowledgments. So really nice. I didn't stay there overnight, but it's a beautiful ranch where you can stay. And then you can like park there and then you can like, then there's like sort of like crappy like roads and trails that you can drive down, but only if you have a 4-wheel drive. And then you have to leave your car and then you can like walk up to the actual hole in the wall itself. But it's like, it's in, I mean, it's like I describe it in the book, like it's in this giant like red rock wall. And the hole itself kind of looks like nothing. Like it's just like this little notch, you know, but it is this place where the outlaws really would go to be able to see everything in the valley and like see if anyone was like about to attack them. But so I went there, I spent about a week in Wyoming and also in Colorado because I wanted to see the area around Pagosa Springs where she kind of ends up. And there's a museum, there's a very strange museum called Hoofprints of the Past. It's in
Oh my God.
Casey. And they have like little mannequins wearing Western outfits that are really amazing. And then also just like a really impressive collection of brands and like belt buckles and guns, which was like super helpful to be able to look at. And even like the main street of Casey itself, like has like a Western movie vibe. Like I sort of based some of those scenes on that because it still looks like it could be 1895. And beyond that, just a ton of reading. So a ton of reading about history, and then also like a ton of reading about midwifery. Like I knew some stuff because in my journalism I report a lot about reproductive health. So I like, you know, had reported a lot on, you know, the practice of midwives today and the history of midwifery. But I didn't know stuff like, yeah, how would you have treated a certain thing in 1894, you know, or what did they know about infertility in 1894? So things like that were things that I had to look up.
That must have been fascinating.
It was really fun.
And
Yeah.
that museum sounds like someplace I need to go
I mean, it's a trip. Yeah. I still have like the
to.
little like commemorative mug that I got there.
Oh man, that's awesome. Um, but I think, I mean, you talked about the medical part of it, and I think one of the things that's so interesting and resonates so much now in like current discourse is this sort of idea of bodily autonomy and how Ada is so clearly trying to help and so wants to be useful. But because of this sort of maybe arbitrary idea of how women's bodies work, you know, she's outcast into all of this. What was that like to be writing about people from so far, like so far in the past? And also maybe like I maybe have a better question. um uh what was it like to be talking about people trying to be sort of self-embodied in a time where that's not something that's ever talked about, like especially as a woman, like your body is not necessarily your own. And you know, we can talk about how that goes into current days, but you know, but what was that like for you? Did you have a specific thought process? Why fertility? um what was that
Yeah.
for?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because so since the book has come out, a lot of people like have asked questions about like accuracy or realism and have been like, well, is this book historically accurate or is it realistic? And it's an alternate history. So like obviously like it's not meant to be like accurate in a certain way. I mean, like there wasn't a great flu. There was a flu pandemic in 1830 that I based that part of the book on, but like obviously it didn't destroy the United States, so we still, for better or for worse, we still have the United States government. So like it's definitely like this. I don't think of this book as taking place in our world. Um, but also like pretty much, I mean, it's like that famous Margaret Atwood quote where she talks about how like nothing, like everything in The Handmaid's Tale like happened in real life. Like basically everything in this book like still happens like today, pretty much. I mean, from like, so in the book, like abortion doesn't play a huge role in the book, but we do see someone who gives abortions, and we hear the story of someone that gets an abortion. And I thought a lot about like, how would I portray that in the book? Like, it was important to me to address that because I figured like, if we have this society that's super obsessed with reproduction, certainly abortion will be illegal and like heavily stigmatized. So what's that going to be like? Um, and then also just the ways that women are treated in the book when they are infertile. You know, I mean, like, we're not like hanging people as witches in 2022, but the stigma still exists, and the sort of like obsessive focus, I think especially for people who are assigned female at birth, the obsessive focus on like whether or not you're going to have a biological child, like that really persists. I mean, when I was writing the book, I did think also a lot about the Salem witch trials, in which people were hanged as witches often for their sort of perceived sexual transgressions or their perceived transgressions like reproductively. So there's that piece too. And I mean, it's also like, I guess I'll also say like writing this was an interesting personal journey for me because I started it when we were thinking about having kids, and then I was working on it while we were trying to get pregnant. And then I got pregnant and I wrote a lot of it while I was pregnant, and I was trying really hard to finish before I gave birth. And then I had my son like a tiny bit early, and I didn't quite finish. And I was like furiously writing like while I was on parental leave with him. And I had like a pretty tough recovery. So it was definitely like, the embodied portions of the book were very much, like I was thinking about that stuff. And then I've been doing, press for the book. And actually, so I didn't experience infertility with my son, but then when we were trying to have another child, we did have secondary infertility. So I went through fertility treatments, and that has like cast the book in a whole different light. And now I'm actually pregnant with my second child. So
Congrats.
thank you. Yeah. So it's like been a whole like this book has like, you know, like encompassed my childbearing years in like a weird way, that also has been like interesting and at times like troubling with everything that's going on with everyone's childbearing years these days.
That must be really intense to be going through, considering having written this book and all of that. Have you, maybe this is not a nice thing to ask, but like,
It's okay.
is there anything that you would, is that there anything now, having been through the time that you've been through, having written this book, like, is there anything you would have gone back and changed?
That's a really good question. I feel like there's a way that I feel like I'm still like in my like fertility journey because like I'm still pregnant, like I haven't had this baby, and so it's like I almost don't know if I have perspective yet. I do think like something that was important to me when I was writing the book was that I didn't know if Ada personally craved to have children. Um, like clearly she needed, like socially, she needed to do it because that's what was required of her socially. But I didn't think of her as someone who had like a really strong internal drive that this is what she wanted to do. I mean, she even says that she's already been a mother, she's already cared for her little sister, like she's kind of had this experience. So like there are moments in the book when she experiences like sadness over not having a child, but it's not like a dominant driving force for her. And I don't think I would change that going back, but like then after I finished it, being in the position of like wanting to have a child and not being sure like would we be able to have another child? Like, then I did experience like a whole spectrum of emotions that like I don't think Ada experiences. And also that I've heard from readers too, because I've heard from a lot of readers who have been through infertility and read the book. And like I think now I certainly like feel more connected to them. And I think it's just like it's less that I would like change Ada's story and more like, okay, I feel like I have a more visceral understanding of like all the different like stories that like all the different women in this world would maybe have, if that makes sense.
Sure, sure. I got the impression that once, and this is me as a reader, I got the impression that once Ada sort of left her home and, was missing her family and missing what she felt to be her purpose, as in midwifery and all of that, I felt that she really felt freed by her ability to sort of live outside of society. And I saw that with the rest of the gang, in that, there are all these societal strictures that are put upon women in particular. And once you get outside of that, you can be who you actually are, or you can pretend to be somebody else to gain freedom and movement within society, or you can just say screw it all and like reject everything and live without all of that. So that's why it kind of made me interested in, and we were talking about this earlier, the kids plan, because it seems so in some ways conventional. I mean, like, I don't, maybe that's not the right word, but like, this notorious outlaw living this free life with the people that are important to them, and all of that. So why try to take over a town? It's such an
Um,
interesting part of the story. And I was like, that doesn't entirely make sense in my brain, but I know it probably does for the kids. So
Yeah, it's funny that you bring that up because so the book has been optioned for TV and like we're still not sure if it's like really going to become a show, but there is a writer attached and I just had like a really nice call with her last week and she was like, "Can you explain the kids' plan to me?" And I was like, "Well, I think the first thing that you have to understand is I don't actually think this is a good plan." Um, and it does like sort of work, but like not really the way that it's intended. And obviously, like people die, and I think like a couple things. Like one, I don't think the kid is good at making plans. Like I think the kid's strength as a leader is to inspire and to like bring people together and the kid is really good at that. And like the kid like inspires a lot of love and like I think people really love the kid and like the kid has built this like gang really as a like a chosen family and like that's their strength. And it's funny when I talk about the kid verbally, like I do slip into they them, even though I never use pronouns in the book. It's like
yeah,
it wasn't hard at all to write without pronouns. But I think just because of like how I might like talk about someone who is non-binary that I know in my life, it's just, like
yeah,
anyway,
I'm right
so,
there with you.
sometimes they kind of switch off. But and it'll be interesting if it does become TV, like how they choose to handle that. I'll be interested to see. But yeah, so basically like the kid comes up with this thing. I don't know that it's a good idea. But I think that I was interested in this tension between like, to what extent should they like, to what extent should the gang like build a new society like that's like big and like has a lot of space and resources for everyone and to what extent should they sort of like be separate from society and just like be like pretty small and not try to like create like not try to like recreate the structures of the society that they came from. And there's probably like a third option too, where they could grow, but still not recreate the structures, right? I mean, like there's like, the potential for them to have like an anarchist society or just like a society that's totally different. But I don't know that necessarily like, it's always like it's hard to picture that, or it's hard to picture something that you don't like have any models for. So in a way, like what the kid has a model for in terms of like how do you like support a lot of people is like, let's make a town. um but it was also like important to me as they're planning that to sort of show conflict within the gang and to show people being like, wait a second, like I don't want to be like a banker, like I don't want to be a mayor. I mean, like when I was writing that part, I try to think about like a DSA meeting or something where they're like, we don't want to be landlords, like what is this? um so I wanted that to come across too. And in terms of like, like what will happen to them like after the end of the book, like how, to what extent does this succeed? Obviously they get this influx of recruits and like, can they handle that? Like, will like the magic of like the hole in the wall gang like be able to be sustained? Like, I don't know. I did want like in the context of, within the confines of the book, like I wanted to create like I wanted to have the gang be like, they're not perfect, but it is like this real haven for the people who are part of it. And like, they have a lot of joy and they have a lot of love. And like, I mean, it's not like a utopia, but I didn't want it to be a dystopia either. Like, I really wanted to show like, they've found this space that's wonderful for them. And like, I guess if they were real people, I would hope that like they find a way to like keep that going. Like, I mean, because the reality is if, in this world, like there are way more people that need that kind of space, both like in the world of the book, but also like in the real world. Like there are lots of people who
Yes.
need those kinds of spaces. So like, how do you expand them? Like how do you make those spaces available to more and more people? Like I think it's a complicated question, and I don't think the kid like has all the answers.
Well, I kind of liked that. I kind of liked that the kid didn't have all the answers. And I liked the kid a lot as a character because of all the flaws and all of the like, I'm not entirely sure that I know what I'm doing, but I'm gonna say that I know what I'm doing. And we're just gonna go with it. I liked sort of the fact that their community was egalitarian, and that there was a overarching acceptance among everybody. Um, but of course, there would be conflict. But you talk about sort of the family and the chosen family, and I had the opportunity to have a chat with TJ Klune a few weeks ago, and I chose this as one of our Pride Month book club selections. Um, and I chose your book and his, but
Mhm.
I think we had a whole conversation about the idea of chosen family being sort of an inherently queer concept.
Mhm.
And I think I recognize that in the gang is that this is a family. This is
Yeah.
absolutely a family, for
Yeah.
better, for worse. Um, and that, yes, they're going to fight. And yes, everybody's going to have their own issues. But at the same time, you can come to this as you are and be accepted. You
Mhm.
can make bad decisions. You're going to fight with your family and you can do all of these things, or you can maybe not sleep forever and make some bad decisions. But um, but I thought that that was really well done as this sort of inherent familial space,
Thank you.
which was why I was like, why do they want to go
I know.
outside? um, so I, so like I said, I really liked the kid. I liked the fact that the kid was mythologized. Um, I liked that the kid was a sort of fault or flawed leader,
Mhm.
and charismatic and complicated and religious and all of those things. What sort of contributed to your creation of that character?
Yeah, the kid was definitely like, the kid took me a long time to feel like I had like gotten the kid's essence right.
Mhm.
Some of the characters came to me more quickly. Like Ada kind of came to me more quickly. Like it wasn't hard to like get her sort of narrative voice in my mind. And then, like the character of News also, I felt like, oh, I know what she's about. Like I felt like I like could get in her headspace pretty easily and quickly. And some of the other characters too, but the kid I really had to kind of like work at. And I think I knew like I knew a few things going in. I knew that the kid like probably was someone that like today we would consider them non-binary or today they would identify as non-binary, but like they don't have that language at that time. You know, I knew I wanted the kid to be like a really like dashing dresser. Like I had this like an idea of like the kid's like fashion sense like pretty early on. And I think that was also in a way sort of like a way to play with the Western tropes a little bit. Like I feel like um you know, your average Western is often is like really like dusty and like yucky. And like I wanted like it's also like a little funny to imagine someone like trying to keep their like beautiful suits like really clean in this like very dusty environment. Um and like you go to Western Wyoming, like it is like very like the red dust is like everywhere. But I think what took me a long time was thinking about like what drives the kid, why do people follow the kid, and actually like what unlocked I think the character for me was realizing that like oh, the kid's dad was a preacher. Like the kid is a preacher in a way. The kid is like an orator. Like the kid like takes this biblical tradition and like is like has beautiful speech and like uses like you know like uses sort of like beautiful like sermons from the Bible as a way to like um you know to get people excited and to get people inspired. And even like you know the members of the gang aren't necessarily all religious. Like Ada's not particularly religious, you know, but they just sort of like they are drawn to the kid in this way. And I think that was what kind of like unlocked the character for me, like knowing how the kid spoke and like feeling like I could get the rhythm of the kid's voice. And then I was like, oh, okay, now I understand. Like now I understand how the kid leads. Like now I understand like the ways the kid fails to lead or the ways that the kid's leadership is like fallible. Um, you know, because like if what you know, if your leadership is based on your ability to like speak really, really well, then the question is like, well, okay, but are you backing that up? You know, and with the kid, like sometimes yes and sometimes no. Um, and I thought also a lot about the relationship between the kid and Cassie and how in some ways like Cassie is the one like who actually has like a good command of logistics and like is like probably pretty good at making plans.
Yeah.
You know, and so they definitely need each other. And like also have like maybe different ideas about like what should happen with the gang. So that kind of interplay was also like I definitely thought of the kid like in tandem with Cassie a lot.
Well, they seem to work very well as a team.
Yeah.
And it seemed like Cassie did have the maybe logistical and logical elements
Yeah.
that the kid may have lacked. But it's interesting that you bring up the idea of oration and all of that because you balance that in interesting ways with Dr. Lively and the eugenics movement and um though just the way information spreads at the time and yes there's preaching, yes there's all of that, but there's an interesting sort of play with I don't know, I'm trying to think of the right word, um not legitimacy but like authority and how and then and then the snake oil salesman and all of that and how each of these people has this sort of charisma and has people following them and has people that are buying into whatever it is that they're saying. What was that like for you to parse out? Because I mean, we were talking about it earlier, and the fact that that whole eugenics movement was real, and you know, and the the snake oil stuff is going on at the same time, which can now kind of in the past be laughed, or in the future be laughed about. And then the kid trying to sort of rally the troops. How did you sort of separate all of that, and what was your decision-making process in including all of those things?
Yeah, I mean the eugenic stuff and like the Dr. Lively parts of the storyline were definitely the most just like ripped from the headlines. Like like I don't know that like Francis Galton ever like brought a, sheep and a goat up on stage, but like it like the rhetoric is just like, that's just history. Like I didn't have to like barely change anything for that. And in the case of those parts of the book, I sort of knew that like if I was going to write this book that was based on the idea that people like got like so obsessed with reproduction and so obsessed with like having big families and having children, I felt like, especially like if this happens like in majority white towns, like among majority white people, like obviously like racism is going to play into this. And like there's going to be like if people, if white people get obsessed with reproduction, they're going to be obsessed with like pure bloodlines and all the kinds of things that like they actually were obsessed with in real life in the 1890s and sometimes are still obsessed with today. Like scientific racism didn't go away. And I think like both with Dr. Lively, but also with the kid, and then even like in the convent, and sort of like with the role of religion in the book generally. I mean, it's interesting that you sort of that I like that reading of thinking about it as like different forms of authority or like people using authority in different ways. Something that was really important to me in the book was that I wanted to show both religion and science like playing different roles in people's lives and in society. Like I didn't want it to be simplistic and like have the message that like religion bad, science good, or like that like religion created all these problems in the society and like science is going to fix them, because I don't think that's true in real life and I don't think it's like that interesting to base fiction on. And so what I wanted to show, a bunch of different ways that people incorporate religion into their lives. And sometimes in the book, like religion is very oppressive, right? People use religion to justify like, murdering women who have infertility, or they use it to justify, racism. They use it to justify all kinds of things. But then people also, we also have this doctor who's using science to justify eugenics, which really happened, which still happens.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you have Ada, who's like trying to use science in a liberatory way, trying to use science to say like, no, I want to understand what's happening with my body. I want to understand what's happening with other people's bodies. I want to help them. um and then we have people using religion in liberatory ways. So we have the kid using religion as a way to inspire, the kids, like as you say, chosen family. Or we have the nuns who like are very religious in a very conventional way for their time, but they're also like politically radical in a certain way, like they're funneling people to the resistance. Which is also true to life. Like convents could, not necessarily in the American West, but in Europe and in South America, could be sort of places where, you know, political radicalism could flourish. So I wanted to look at these institutions of religion and science and just show them in their complexity, I think, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
I know one of our members wants to ask a question, but I also want to piggyback on that because I have one more thing. I think about, because I think this is all related, and the idea of communication, and the book mostly takes place in an isolated, and not an isolated, but a relatively specific geographic location. They move around a bit, but it's still geographically sort of the West. I think of what would have happened had Ada been able to figure out what causes barrenness. Were these societal witch hunts based on infertility happening in other parts of what used to be I'm kind of curious about what you think was happening elsewhere. Did you think
Yeah,
about that, or
that's a great question. And people have asked me that. People have asked me that a lot. Even like when I was working on the book, sometimes my writing group would be like, what's happening in the rest of the world? And I sort of kept maintaining like a tunnel vision. I was like, okay, good question, but I need to focus on
yeah.
like what's happening like right here. Um, but I did think about I thought a lot about like, okay, what does the landscape of the former United States look like? And like what, to what extent has each part been affected by the flu? To what extent has each part, like what are the different governments like? I thought a lot about like, okay, like I think the US government has ceased to exist. So there are these sort of like independent towns where like former Americans live. But I sort of, the way that I planned it out in my mind, I was like, well, but a lot of indigenous nations like still exist and probably are flourishing like much more than they actually were in real life 1894. Like imagine if the US like in the context of the book, the US basically ceases to exist like sometime between 1830 and 1860. And like imagine if like there just wasn't a US federal government, like they're, bad for some people, better for other people. I thought about a lot about like what happened instead of the Civil War. And in earlier drafts of the book, there was actually more sort of like alternate history talking about that stuff. I didn't think as much about what was happening like overseas. I think partly because it just like felt too big, like it felt too big to hold in my head. Like I was holding all this like fictional history in my head, and it was so much. But like there's a part where they have to get some stuff from China, so clearly like there is international trade. And like I imagined like, okay, well, if something's coming from China, it's coming to California, and then it's coming from California like into the east. But I guess like now sort of like thinking about it more, I sort of I mean, to go back to something that I was saying earlier, I did base the Great Flu on a real flu pandemic. Like I mean, this is well before COVID. Like I looked up like history of flu pandemics, and I just like picked the one, like there was one from 1830 to 1831. I was like, okay, that's a good like year to have my history split from real history. So we're going to pretend that that flu pandemic was far more devastating than it was, but it was still devastating. And like in real life, I think swept through China and Russia before then sweeping through Western Europe and making it to the United States. So like already like the world was connected even in 1830. And so I guess when I try to think about the world of the book, I think, I mean, you bring up communication. I think that in a lot of ways, the world of the book is quite isolated. Like people don't have a lot of communication between towns, certainly between continents, but also there's some, and I also imagine that there are some places that have been like less affected by the flu than other places. And certainly I don't imagine that this particular kind of cultural obsession with infertility and fertility that pervades the globe. So like I mean like in the book, like for example, like indigenous characters are usually horrified when they find out about like barren women being hanged. And I sort of imagine that people in like other countries, to the extent that those other countries still exist, would also probably be horrified.
Yeah.
um so that's like a long way of saying like there's a world out there. I think Ada, you're right that Ada is pretty cut off from it, but I imagine there being a world out there that's like pretty different than the one she's living in.
That's a really satisfying answer. Thank you.
Welcome.
I know I've been hogging all the question asking. I know, Kara, you have a question. Please, anybody else jump in because I'm totally hogging it. So
I didn't know if you did something at the end, so I just wanted to
no.
like so I loved the part, well, I don't want to say loved, but it really opened my eyes, the part when Ada couldn't get pregnant and they actually hired the guy to come have sex with her on a regular basis. And this was kind of opened my eyes. Like, first of all, that's brilliant. Second of all, oh my gosh, there's a whole network. Like this is she's not the first person to do this. This is all put in place because of this fragile male ego. Oh my gosh, you can't say that it's me. And then all of a sudden I'm like, wait, does this really happen? Of course it's got to happen. Did you come across in your research that this was that anything like this happened or was known in as far as like midwives or saying that people would find other partners just to not hurt their husband's feelings, or however you want to put it?
I didn't find like a real life example of that, but it just seemed like something that like if you were savvy, it seemed like you would do it. I mean, I haven't like again, like I haven't read any like firsthand accounts of someone doing that, but like 50 like when like a couple is infertile, like when a heterosexual couple, right, like are not able to get pregnant after X amount of time, like 50% of the time the man has the issue. So, but that was, before, very recently, like nobody ever acknowledged that. And like people would only talk about barren women and never talk about like, never talk about sperm, never talk about the man. So it made sense to me that, Ada's mother is smart. She's been a midwife for a long time. Like she would know that sometimes the man has the problem, and she would know that like there's probably only one way to know. But no, I mean, I would love to know if like that, if that ever happened in real life, because it seems like
Oh,
it
that
seems
was great.
obvious.
It was brilliant. I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think like, oh my God, and it like opened up a whole can of worms for me that I was thinking about that. So that was great. And if I can slip in one other question,
Sure.
how did you feel when, like, how were you notified that this was going to be a Reese's book club pick? And were you like, oh my gosh, this is great? Or like, oh crap, this is scary? What were your feelings and how did you handle it?
Yeah, I mean, they did tell me ahead of time, like they told, I think my agent called me. So like they told my agent, they told my editor, and then because there's like a couple of things that you do ahead of time. Like I think I wrote a little essay ahead of time, and like I sent them, some photos and like some other because they did, I mean, they still do this, but especially like, this book came out in January 2021. So that was like very like deep pandemic time. They did a lot on Instagram. And so I sent them like, some of my research materials and like photos that I had taken that they then were able to post on their Instagram. Yeah, I mean, mostly I was just really excited. Like I was really surprised. Like I hadn't really like I sort of knew that like it was something that like would be really great for the book if it happened, but like I didn't know, like they don't tell you anything like about the process. So I didn't know that it was like in the running. Um and then it sort of suddenly happened, and it was also like still like that. I mean, it's still a weird time for books, but that was like an extra weird time for books. So like my agent and I were like pretty worried. Like bookstores were still mostly, a lot of them were closed. Like I definitely wasn't doing any in-person readings, or like how are we even going to promote this book? Like is anyone going to read it? And so in a lot of ways it was like, oh my gosh, like this is such a huge like such a huge thing for like this time, because we know that like this is a way that people could actually like find out about the book in a time when a lot of people are like in their houses. So like that's the reason I'm like super grateful to like Reese's Book Club and Bellatrist and like like all the other like book clubs in general. Like I feel like especially in the pandemic, they really like, have like brought books to people when it's like has been hard for people to find out about books and hard for writers to connect with readers.
I will say that that's certainly true. Having, run book clubs and
Yeah.
trying to connect to people,
Yeah.
there's something powerful to be said about that. Does anybody else have any questions for Anna? Feel free to jump in.
Is the TV show or potential TV show being produced by Reese's company?
No, it's not. It's actually it's being produced by A24 and
Oh,
an Amy Adams production company. So they are working together on it. And yeah, knock on wood. We'll
that's
see
great.
what happens with it.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
keep an eye out for that for
Yeah.
sure. I was curious if you were able to talk about what you're currently working on or anything like that.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. It's so funny. Like I'm pretty deep into this new project. And it's always funny to talk about like the previous book when you're working on something new because you're like, how did I make those decisions and like why? And like, was I just like dumber than like it's
No, you're in it.
who did this? um, but yeah, so I'm working on another book. I'm really happy that I'm working with my same editor from Outlawed and same publishing house, so it'll be with Bloomsbury. And it's about, so have folks heard of bog bodies?
Yes.
Yeah, so for anyone who hasn't, so basically like in the Iron Age, so thousands of years ago, sometimes people would either fall or get pushed into like a marsh or bog in Europe, usually in England or in Sweden and in the colder parts of Europe. And then the thing about these bogs is that they would preserve the bodies forever, almost like they just died. So archaeologists and experts have been able to like dig them up and they look like they're sleeping. They look like a modern human. It's like kind of terrifying the way that like the chemical composition of the bog just like makes like it's like time didn't happen almost. And so there are these really important scientific finds. But they're also murder mysteries because it's like a lot of them show signs of violence. And at a basic level, you're like, well, how did this person fall in the bog? And so there's a specific murder mystery that that I got interested in years ago. Where actually, I mean, I'll tell a little bit of the story. I'm gonna be hopefully telling it more, but so basically, this was in the 80s when bog bodies were sort of less well known. So in central England, some young men find a body in this marsh, and a local guy comes forward and he's like, yeah, okay, like that's my wife. I murdered my wife. I threw her in the bog. Like, I'm really sorry. I confess. And then like the local anthropologist is like, okay, sorry, but this body is from the year like minus 500. So no, I don't know where your wife is. And the guy's like, oh, JK, but he still, I think, had to go to jail. And so I got just really like fascinated by the story and all the elements of it. And also just the bodies themselves and thinking about, there's controversy now about them and how they should be displayed, and like some of them are in museums and there's a real question around like, is it okay to like display human remains in that way, and like should they in fact like be, some people are like we should rebury them, we should just put them back. So I just got really interested in all these questions, and so the new book is, it's sort of a, I mean, it's a little bit of a murder mystery about an anthropologist who finds a bog body and everything that happens after that. And it's a little bit based on that story. So that's what I'm working on now, and I'm yet again trying to finish it before I have a baby. So we'll see how I do.
That's fascinating. Do you have a publishing date yet? Or
I don't think so. I'm supposed to turn it in June of next year, which like feels like a long time, but I'm supposed to have the baby in September. So like it's not actually a long time. But I think we're hoping it'll be like, sometime in 2024.
That's really exciting. And it sounds like a fascinating story. I've known about the bog bodies for a while because I have weird friends and worked in the weird museum world for a long time. But yeah, they're puzzling and fascinating and bring up all kinds of ethical issues. So I can't wait
Yeah.
to read that. How do you keep your stories so varied? I read Sophie Stark and it's nothing like this.
Yeah, it's not. I don't know. I sort of just I feel like usually when I'm working on something, there's like something else on deck that I'm obsessed with, and it so far hasn't had that much to do with the thing that happened before. Um, but who knows? I mean, a lot of people like have asked me like if I'm gonna write a sequel to Outlawed, and as of now, no. Like I sort of think of like if the TV series happens, like that can be like the sequel in my mind, and like other people can
Mhm.
like take it and kind of run with it. But Yeah, I mean, I think so far I just like once I've written a book, I feel like that line of thinking is like exhausted for now and I need to go on to something else. But who knows? Like I know there are writers who like years and decades later like return and do a sequel to something. So we'll see.
Sounds great. It's good to have varied interests, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's all the questions I have. Does anybody else have anything you want to ask or comment, or maybe not? All right. Well, Anna, thank you so much for your time. I know you had to get a babysitter. I'm sorry about that.
No, I mean, seriously, he's obsessed with her. He wishes she would be here all the time.
That's great. You found a good one.
Yeah.
But thank you for taking the time regardless. And it's always such a treat to be able to dig in deeply with something, with a book, and then talk to the person who created it, because I feel like it just opens up the understanding so much more. So I so appreciate it. And keep going. I will keep an eye out for the next one.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. Thanks so much for reading. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a great night, everyone.
Good night.
You
Thank you,
too.
Anna.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye.